Just a little warning, this episode will have, references to suicide. The Rohan Plus One Show. Welcome to the Rohan Plus One Show. My plus one for this episode has won the Point of Light Award and has also been to 10 Downing Street. And she's here to share her story. Tanya, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm good.
Good.
So let's dive in. So where did your journey with mental health begin?
My journey with my mental health started from pretty much as young as I can remember, I think, since I was a child. I just remember being a very emotional child. You know, when you're growing up, you kind of get labels attached to you. So I was kind of called the one who used to cry a lot, kind of dramatic, really sensitive, used to feel her emotions quite a lot. I remember getting overwhelmed very often, and I just internalized that narrative and thought, maybe I'm just shy, maybe it's something I'll grow out of. And I think that's what everyone around me used to believe. And then it was around the age of when I hit around 12 years old where I just started to kind of dig deeper into some of those thoughts and feelings, and they weren't very happy thoughts, and that's when the suicidal ideation kicked in. And during that period of time as well, we started to experience bereavement on my father's side of the family, and I think that just kick-started the mental ill health journey that I've been on since then. And I also started to experience physical health symptoms, so chronic pain and chronic fatigue. And that was a point of time that I could probably pinpoint and say that that's when I remember that the journey kind of picked up its intensity, but it's been with me for my entire life.
Yeah, and you're talking about, the suicide thoughts. Where, did that come from?
I don't know. And I think everyone wants to know the reason why. I think you as yourself always want to know, what is it? Is it an external factor that's causing me to feel this? Do I have a mental health condition? But what I've learned over the years is that there doesn't need to be a reason as to why someone's experiencing suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts. And I know that those around me were really desperate for me to find a reason because they wanted to help me. It's easier to fix the problem when you know what's causing it. But in reality, I don't know, and I still can't tell you what it was. I know that when I was 15, I was eventually diagnosed with depression and anxiety. So that probably played a factor into it. But suicidal ideation has lived with me from as young as I can remember. Often people say that, you have to try and find reasons to think that life isn't worth living. But if I'm completely honest, since I've been young, I'm always trying to find reasons to think life is worth living every day. And it sounds quite sad to say that that's your perception of day-to-day life. But when I speak to more suicide survivors, I realize that it's actually sometimes a shared kind of narrative that you have in your head. And I don't know what causes it.
Yeah, and, during these thoughts and, how did it make you, feel as a person? Did it kind of, just knock you down?
I think you just feel empty. I just remember feeling empty, and that feeling still does creep up on me. You just feel empty. Life doesn't really feel like it's worth it. And I think you develop a lot of self-apathy and negative self-talk, and then that becomes a cycle that just continues to perpetuate itself. And it becomes really hard to get out of it. And, people say there's light at the end of the tunnel, but in that moment, you feel like there is no light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and, at the start, did you feel like you had anyone to talk to?
I guess practically speaking, yes, I had my family members, I had my friends, I had loved ones around me. But did I personally feel like I could speak to anyone about it? No, because how do you put that into words? I think I started to, because it felt normal to me, I started to think maybe it's a me problem and maybe it's just something I need to overcome myself. And then when I got to the point where I started to talk to my parents about it, for example, I just didn't know how to express it. And, like I said before, when there's a problem, everyone wants to fix it with goodwill, but that isn't necessarily the approach that's needed to take in that situation.
Yeah, no. And, along the journey at the start, did the thoughts keep coming and coming? And was there any point at the start where you tried to make them go away?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like every day was a battle of trying to make those thoughts dissipate or at least reduce in themselves. Like I remember being at school and being in a lesson and trying to focus, and those thoughts would be there. But I guess the thing was that they were always in the background. No matter how much I tried to move away from them, they were always there. And I think the way I describe it is, you know, like as a person, your shadow never leaves you. It was kind of like that it would just never leave me. And even today, like I still experience them. It's just that I know how to cope with them in a better way, which is what I didn't know when I was 13 years old.
Yeah, and when, to what age did it kind of, get to like its max?
It comes and goes.
Yeah.
I'd say I've hit what I would call the max multiple times. Yeah. I'd say the worst that it got was actually last year. Before that, it was when I was at university. But I think oftentimes people think because you're in the space and you advocate for it that you're kind of on the other side. But the truth is it's an ongoing journey. So last year was pretty bad in that sense.
Yeah, and even at uni, right? Was it quite hard? Did you live away from home at uni?
Yeah, I did.
So did that make it even harder as well?
Yeah, I think uni was an interesting one. It was during COVID. So that obviously played a big factor into everything that went on. But I think also you see uni as like the best couple of years of your life. And for me, it wasn't like that. It was a very dark period of my life. And you can't really explain that to the people that are around you. And that's also the pivotal point at which I decided that I need to kind of approach this factor in my life in a different way, because I'm going to have to live with it. When I was growing up, I kind of wished that it was something that I would overcome and it would be a phase in my life, but obviously that's not the case. So I think that point was there was a lot of acceptance needed.
Yeah, and what was like kind of the switch that that you had in your mind to tell you that that I'm gonna fight this?
I think I just turned 19. I'd just finished my first year of uni. I was just finished my first year of uni, and I was at home because COVID had happened, and I had just had my most recent suicide attempt. And I remember a week later getting an urgent referral to the mental health services near me, and I had the assessment, and she just kind of told me, you seem like you're okay now. There's nothing we can do. If you feel like that again, go to your GP or ring 111 or 999. And I was like, okay. And I went home and I just thought, no matter how many times I've got to that point, the support hasn't been there for me. And as much as I don't want to deal with this myself, I feel like I kind of have to pick myself up. And I've kind of have two options in life. One is to continue going on in the way that I have done for like that many years, or I try to kind of allow it to empower me, because I'm going to have to live with this for the rest of my life. And I just decided, surely I'm not the only one. Let's just talk about it. And I think at that point, I also reflected that throughout my years in education, no one had ever taught me about mental health, which is probably why I felt so lonely, because I felt like I was the only person experiencing that. But I actually found that I wasn't alone when I went online or when I did Google searches or when I saw stuff on social media. So isn't it just ridiculous that we're not taught about mental health in school? So that really was, I guess, the pivotal point for me.
Yeah, and do you think that, mental health should be talked about more in schools?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a balance to get around. Obviously, it just needs to be talked about in the same way that we talk about physical health, right? Like physical health is taught to us from as young as we can remember. So just about getting that balance. I think if you go into a classroom and you ask children, put your hands up if you have physical health, every child will put their hand up. And if you ask them to put their hand up if they've got mental health, only a few of them will put their hands up. So it's just about getting that understanding about that it's just the same as physical health. It's something that we all have, demystifying a lot of the stigma around it, and just making sure children are empowered and confident enough that if they do start to struggle with their mental health, that they know who to speak to, how to seek support, and how to manage it.
And till this day, do you think it's still like a support system, or do you think there is like places where people can go, or do you think there's not enough of that still to this day?
There are quite a lot of like places that people can go. I work with a lot of number of charities and organisations that do such amazing work. The issue is that not enough people know about them. So I think there's a big knowledge gap that needs to be bridged at the moment between the general public and these amazing organisations and charities who do provide free support, free resources. You just need to know how to access them and when to access them.
Yeah, and do you think like, how can that be done? Is that through social media or?
I think social media is obviously a great tool to bridge that gap, but I think also having conversations around mental health makes it easier to engage people in it. I know that at the moment, a lot of the people that I talk to are people who either have lived experience of mental health difficulties, have been impacted by it, or are interested in it. But there are still so many people in the general public that we aren't talking to about mental health. And, you know, we do talk to the general public about physical health. So why not the same for mental health?
Yeah, because it's a balance, right? You need to have as well as physical, mental health, right? And, you know, onto like the awareness and stuff, you set up your own company, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so when I was at university, when this kind of pivotal turning point happened for me, I just started kind of creating content on Instagram and posting it. And I called it Championing Youth Minds. And that's a youth-led non-profit organisation. And the whole purpose of it is to empower and educate young people to take care of their mental well-being every day. So a lot of it for me was revisiting that idea about the lack of education in schools and doing something positive about it. And I got lots of kind of DMs and messages from other young people and my peers who had similar experiences and wanted to share their stories and create resources. So eventually we went on to create posters and resources for schools. We've hosted workshops. We did a 10-week summer workshop program where we had over 150 young people and parents and carers attend. And we go into schools and we, you know, support them, not just the young people in terms of mental health, but also parents and carers, teachers and staff around engaging young people in mental health conversation. So I think for me, it was really just a passion project, and to see so many young people wanting to engage in it just goes to show me how important it is that we're providing them with opportunities that they can explore, learn and feel more confident when it comes to talking and managing their mental health.
Yeah, and when it comes to, you know, the younger generation, would you approach the topic of mental health in a different way to make them understand it a bit more easier than, you know, like adults?
Yeah, I think it's just embedding it into day-to-day topics. So that's what we did with our workshop program, is we just chose day-to-day themes that young people enjoy, like art, music, sports, and just try to integrate mental health into that, because we know that mental health impacts and is the foundation of pretty much all our experiences in life. So that just makes it more accessible to people. And I think when you say the word mental health, a lot of people step back and they get a bit scared. So kind of making it more palatable is a great first step in getting people to engage into it.
And like in terms of yourself, like what have you done to help improve your mental health?
Yeah, I think it's been a journey. Obviously, I've had quite a lot of professional support, so therapy, counselling, antidepressants on and off. Personally, they haven't really worked for me, but I know they work for a lot of different people. But for me, it's just been a journey of learning and acceptance, and, you know, being on this journey of advocating about mental health hasn't necessarily meant that it's been easy at times. Like I said, last year was really difficult for me. And I think it's just reminded me that the most important thing is that I put my mental health first, and have a lot of those techniques and strategies that personally work for me on a day-to-day basis to make sure I can check in with myself. If I'm starting to feel like, you know, my mental health's taking a bit of a negative turn, okay, who do I go to? Who do I speak to? How do I handle this? I think it's really been building my own toolbox whilst trying to help others build theirs.
And with, you know, mental health and stuff, do you think it's harder for someone, you know, in the South Asian community, like with the suicide thoughts, with the, you know, mental health, do you think it's harder for someone in the South Asian community to get the, you know, resources and to find people to speak to?
Generally speaking, I've seen trends of that, and that was personally my experience. I think there is so much stigma and lack of education around kind of mental health, what mental ill health looks like, and suicide. And I don't think that's anyone's fault. I think it's just the fact that, you know, there's certain entrenched beliefs that remain within our community that act as barriers at times. And for me personally, it was just about kind of unlearning a lot of those beliefs and re-educating not just myself but those around me. And, you know, we do see statistically that a lot of the statistics around suicide, for example, aren't accurate numbers, because there probably are so many individuals, for example, within our community who don't accurately report a suicide. They change what's the cause of death on the death certificate. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in specific communities like ours.
In terms of statistics, like, you know, with this, like how many people in our community, you know, suffer with this?
Okay, so not just in our community, in the UK as a whole, 17 people die by suicide every day. Now, there are not specific statistics that tell us the number of those, how many of those 17 were South Asian. And I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of that, which is something I'm working on, is around how we're reporting suicides and understanding how that impacts certain groups. If you look at, there is very little research out there around suicide statistics in the South Asian community. But from what I've seen, rates of attempted suicide are 2.5 times more likely in South Asian women than there are in white women. This was reported in 2018. And self-harm attempts are much higher in South Asian women, especially the age group of 16 to 24 years old. So that's a very specific kind of example of statistics. But obviously, you know, I could name just off the top of my head statistics that aren't reported in that from just friends and families and extended people in the community. So I think the reason why maybe there's not enough attention given to it is because there's just not the statistics to show the real picture.
Yeah, and you know, the big difference is that in that number, do you think there's like a particular reason? Is it, you know, if they're getting pressure from family and, you know, stuff like that, do you think like pressure and like maybe, you know, what other people think of them plays a big factor in that?
I think there's a lot of, I think the risk factors for our community probably differ slightly from if we're looking at like the white community. I think, you know, reputation, stigma, religion, tradition play such a big role in our community. And I think sometimes they can be the risk factors that lead to suicide or attempted suicide. And I think that's where a lot of the education piece comes around. I think even just sometimes how we view suicide or how we view mental ill health, for example, can be detrimental and can lead to people, you know, thinking of suicide or dying by suicide. So that's kind of the area that I'm really passionate about. Is I think we're doing a good job in the UK around talking about mental health and talking about suicide prevention, but there needs to be targeted efforts in communities like ours where there are cultural barriers to overcome, language barriers to overcome, and it takes all of us to get into having conversations to make this more of a accessible topic for us.
Yeah, and in our like community, do you think like, you know, the pressure of getting married, having kids, let's say at a certain age, like doing like making money, for example, and you know, like what other family think also, do you think that cloud still looms over, you know, our community?
Yeah, I mean, if I speak about myself personally, my parents are very kind of liberal in the sense that they've never put pressure on me that you need to do X, Y, Z. But I think it's just the train of belief that's been entrenched in us generationally, which is that, like you said, you study, you get a good job, you then get married, you have children, etc. So I think for me that narrative is still in my head, and it's an everyday challenge to try and break that. And I think for me personally, one thing that really impacted my mental health was also my identity. And I see a lot of British Indians struggle with similar things, which is that you're born and brought up in the UK, but your roots are back home in India. And the way I sum it up is I never felt British enough to be British, but never felt Indian enough to be Indian. And I think oftentimes that identity almost crisis that you feel like you're having can also impact your mental health quite a bit.
Yeah, and you know, do you think having that support system around yourself, having like your friends or your family to talk to, helps, especially when you're going through you know, a tough time?
Yeah, it definitely helps, but there needs to be conversations around, okay, so in this moment, what type of support is the thing that's going to be best for you right now? I think, once again, like I speak to a lot of parents and carers and young people, and oftentimes they have a great relationship with their parents or their carers, but when they're struggling with their mental health, they don't want their parent or carer to get into fix mode. They want them to just be actively listening. So I think sometimes it's just understanding what the best support looks like at that point of time is important.
Yeah, and you know, with, you know, mental health, and do you think like what people see on social media is what people think the world is? Like, do you think social media has had like such a big influence on how people think, on how people feel nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Like, me and my sister were talking about it the other day, like, what did we do before TikTok existed? Because I don't know how I use my time. So I think definitely there's obviously positives to social media, and social media has been instrumental in this mental health advocacy journey of mine. But I think, yeah, you're just living in a bubble. Like, you don't really know what's real and what's not real. And even the friends and family that you think you do know, what you see on social media, you're not really sure kind of if that's their reality, you know, what's going on with them. So I think for me personally, social media, I really struggle with it. So I try to remove myself as much as possible. And I think it's so hard, especially at our age, to not consume and not be engaging and active on there because everyone else is. But sometimes placing those boundaries is really important for your own mental health, and recognizing it is actually really hard because, you know, you could just be looking at a friend's post and not realizing how that's actually making you feel.
Yeah, and also it is also looking at what you see there, and you know, you might think it's cool, or you might think, you know what, it's fun, but at this end of the day, it might actually not be, like, it might be doing harm to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you need to take it with a pinch of salt and just be careful of what you see, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to have education and sessions with young people about safe use of social media. I know that in schools, a lot of teachers do sessions on like cyberbullying or you know, online grooming, but I think young people would just benefit from having conversational discussions around how can you use social media, you know, the everyday stuff you see on things like Instagram or platforms that you're connected with your friends, like recognizing how that might make you feel, and if it's making you feel anxious or nervous. Like for me, certain apps make me feel really anxious, you know, how to tackle that. So perhaps it's muting certain people or setting a timer as to, you know, how long you go on for it. So I think small techniques like that, I think, are sometimes like missed out.
Yeah, and you know, how can people, you know, like overcome that bubble? What techniques or what apps or what can they do to overcome, you know, that you know, also like that, but not burden, but how can they, you know, overcome the stress of social media?
I think the big thing for me is self-reflection and self-awareness. So once you realize, or you have an idea of, okay, this is making me feel this way, I think then you can action it. So if I take the example of myself, I remember like LinkedIn was making me feel really anxious. Just couldn't explain it. It just made me panic every time I went onto it. And then when I realized that, okay, it's LinkedIn that's making me feel like this, so what can I do about it? Maybe reduce the amount of content that I'm consuming. When I post, don't scroll through everyone else's post. Just post and get off the app. So I think it's kind of trial and error. It's trying to figure out what works for you. But I think the challenge that we've all faced is like we're still recovering from the COVID world that we were living in. So it's almost like we have to reintroduce ourselves to life outside of our phones and our gadgets, which is, you know, no one's fault. And I can say for myself, I'm still pretty bad at it.
Because do you think COVID had a huge effect on, you know, people in terms of not like physical health, but like their actual like well-being and mental health? Do you think COVID kind of shut it down?
Yeah, I think it did. And I think also the positive that came out of COVID was that everyone had to just stop. And when you stop, you realize, okay, these are the things that are going on internally. And if I think about it, even like working now, like the days that I work from home, I get to focus so much more on my own well-being. Whereas the days that I'm out and about in London, going into the office, everything's so fast-paced, I don't get a moment for myself. So I think COVID was just that moment to stop and breathe and realize, okay, this is what's going on for me internally. But also if I remove the expectations of work or the pressure of work and all the external things around me, who am I and what do I want to work on?
Yeah, and I think because I guess everyone was in lockdown and stuff, you were isolated, right? You didn't have anyone to kind of go to as well.
Yeah, I think that as well. And I think also a lot of vulnerability came out of COVID. I think we were all seeing each other as humans again. So I think with that human component came a lot about talking about mental health, you know, mental health difficulties or positive mental health, or what people do to manage their mental health.
And, you know, like once everything, like in terms after COVID, right? How did you feel in terms of like your well-being as well? Did you feel like, you know, I can get out there, I can, you know, and enjoy like life and...
No and yes. I think for me it was like, personally, I think I've always struggled with anxiety since I was younger, but being able to be in my shell behind a screen meant that I started to really struggle with things like socializing, or just like certain, like, so when I'm really anxious, I pick on the sides of my fingers. It's not a good habit, but I could do that behind a screen and it was completely fine. But then when I'm sitting in person and I'm doing this and someone's like, what are you doing? Like, it's small things like that. And I think also just trying to make those new habits or those priorities that I formed during COVID time fit in with actual what real life looks like. And I think a lot of us are still recovering from like what people call like the COVID hangover. And I'm sure we all are experiencing it in some way.
Yeah, because, well, now, I mean, I guess everything is getting back to how it was. But, you know, like nowadays, how can, you know, it's a new year, right? It's 2024. How can people set out goals and like go and achieve them? Like, what are some steps people can do to, you know, go out and just have a great year?
I go back to my self-reflection, self-awareness piece. I think there is so much pressure for us when we are on social media to have some of the same goals that we see on there. You know, sometimes you see those very aesthetic vision boards and you think that's what I want for my life. But I think sometimes it's just taking a step back and evaluating 2023, the year just went. What is it that you want to work on for yourself, and how do you make the year the way you want it to be? So when you look back at it on the 1st of January 2025, you're like, okay, 2024 was a happy year for me. I think happy is the key word. Me and my friend were having this discussion the other day, and we were talking, he said this thing to me and I was like, wow, that's just amazing. But he said to me, like, if you asked me at the start of university what I wanted to be, I would have said I wanted to change the world. But if you ask me today what I want to do, I just want to be happy. And I was like, oh my goodness, that sums up everything that I've been feeling. So going back to your question, I think it's really about evaluating what you want and what you need to be happy. And then when it comes to setting those goals, break it down into achievable things. You know, how can you track and measure your progress? And I think understanding that goals aren't necessarily a destination, it's more like a continuous journey that you pick up things as you go away, and those goals will constantly change and evolve. I think uncertainty is something that scares us all a lot, but trying to change that perception of uncertainty is definitely a liberating feeling.
And do you believe in the new year, new me stuff? Do you believe in that, or is it just BS basically?
Yes and no again. I think for some people it really works, right? You need that reset to be like, okay, this is when I'm going to implement new habits. This is when I'm going to implement my new mindset. But I think it's important to remember that new habits or a new you doesn't have to start on the 1st of January in the new year. It could start, you know, on a random Wednesday in the middle of a month, or it doesn't need to be tomorrow. It doesn't need to be Monday, and it doesn't need to be the 1st of January is what I say. I think just is working out what works for you. And that sounds so broad and so vague, but I think the difficulty is right now is that with a lot of stuff I see on social media, it's boxing you into a narrative. So it's like either I pick this one or I pick this one. But that's why I'm saying working out what works for you is so important. So you break free from those pre-made boxes that are there, and you just kind of work it out for yourself.
Yeah, and in terms of like New Year's resolutions as well, do you think people need to have like more realistic ones? Like people might say, I want, you know, let's just say I want to like look good, or I want, you know, a good body, a physique, or, you know, I want to make X amount of money. But do you think there needs to be like a realistic approach to that? I mean, it can be achievable if you put your mind to it, but do you believe in the resolutions as well?
I think if you take a constructive approach, yes. So by constructive approach, I mean thinking about it. So if you're saying, I want to make X money this year, okay, so how much do you want to make? Define that firstly, and then define over what time period. So you're saying 12 months. What is, in what form? Is that through your day job? Is that through side hustles? If it's side hustles, what are those side hustles? It's almost like working backwards and adding as much detail in as possible. I think if you can make constructive resolutions, definitely go for it. But I think those big picture items of I'm going to have a 6-pack just standalone doesn't really necessarily work.
And I think in terms of like achieving your goals for the year and, you know, completing your resolutions, how important is a good routine?
I think very important. And I think obviously different people prioritize routines in a different way. I know for me, a routine I've learned is something that's very important. But I think it's also giving yourself that flexibility with a routine. Sometimes we can beat ourselves up over not following a routine one day, or, you know, it slightly kind of changes, falls out of practice. So I think once again, it's just being agile, because life is going to throw so much at you and you can't anticipate everything that's going to happen from now until December at the end of this year. So it's just being flexible with things and trying to have backup plans. And I think the key thing for me is like just being kind to yourself. Like I think this is my hypothesis now, that the fun in life is meant to be not knowing what's going to happen and going with the flow. But for a lot of people like myself who need structure and routine and need to know what's going to happen, it can be really hard. But trying to just let go and going with the flow, I think, is easier said than done. But
Yeah,
it's helping.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go, yeah, I mean, yeah, because having that routine, I guess you're right, you're set, you know what you're going to do. But then at the same time, I think, you know, there was this thing where if like God was to show you the plan of where you want to come, you would say no.
Yeah.
That's probably true, because you might like get put off. You can be like, I don't want to put into work. I don't want to go through this just to achieve that. But so that's what, well, you know, that's why it's important to just remember why you're doing it as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same with like birth charts and things like that, right? It's like some people are like, yes, I want to know what's in there and I want to know what my life is going to look like. And some people are like, actually, no, leave the suspense. I want to discover it bit by bit. I think it's going back to the fact that it shouldn't be about the destination. It should be about the journey. Yeah. And regardless of the decisions you make, that journey is always going to be exciting. There's always going to be things to learn. There's always going to be challenges. So if you can just try to bring yourself back to the present, then life will just feel a little bit easier than it does if you're constantly thinking about what's next.
Yeah, because I guess in life in general, it's not just going to be an uphill, like smooth kind of uphill journey, right? It's going to be like a roller coaster. There will be ups and there will be downs, but it's how you deal with those downs. And, you know, you want to make sure that, you know, let's just say someone's, you know, like fell down, like they've had a hard down, but it's like, okay, how can I get back up, right? It's not just like you can sit there, right? But it's not sitting there for too long, right? It's actually being able to have that proactive mind and think, okay, how am I going to get up?
Yeah. So resilience, right? Yeah. And I think resilience is such a key thing when we're talking about mental well-being. And it just goes back to my earlier point around, that's why it's so important to teach young people about mental well-being. What does good mental well-being look like? What does mental ill health look like? What does your mental health look like when perhaps you're dealing with some of those downs? So for example, like if you look at the school system that we have in the UK, you study, it's kind of a bit chill until you get to GCSE's point, and then it's like stress is all of a sudden the norm, but no one's taught you what stress is, how to deal with stress. You know, the fact that is then going to be continued into when you join A-levels or when you go to university. So I think it's just, and then it's only with hindsight that I've learned now that, okay, stress is inevitable, challenges are inevitable, it's how I cope with them. But until you teach young people that and you teach them the skills and strategies, they're going to think that low is going to stay forever.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, once you overcome it, you'll look back and think, you know what, it was worth it at the end, right? Like you look back at it and think, you know what, I put in the work. I did what I set out to, you know, and I achieved it.
I mean, like, if I think, like, I didn't think 13-year-old me would know the things that I'm doing right now. 13-year-old me probably thought her life was going to end then. So it just goes back to that resilience piece.
Yeah, because even, like, for me, example, I never thought I was going to set this up, you know. But I guess it's part of the plan. And I think a quote that's kind of, that I remember is, and this is actually from like WWE, but it's actually stuck with me. I remember it. I'll try and remember it fully, but it's like, if life like throws a curveball at you, he says, like, I'm the guy that, you know, is gonna like swing for the fences. He's gonna choke up in that batting cage and swing for the fences. So, you know, it's just about overcoming that hurdle, right? And you're gonna get many hurdles, right?
Yeah. 100%. It's guaranteed. That's the one thing in life that's guaranteed, right? Is that challenges. But if someone told me that before, I wouldn't have stressed so much about things.
But I guess that's the point of life as well. It's about self-discovery, right?
Yeah.
As well, right? You go through the journey and you learn new stuff, you find out more about yourself as well.
100%.
And let's talk about like self-love as well. Like how important is that with mental health? Like where does self-love fit into all of this?
So important. I think I said to you before, like I had such a negative self-talk and a view of myself, and then that just made things worse and worse. And I think a lot of it for me has been discovering a lot of traumas I have and working through them with my therapist and with professionals, and then on a day-to-day basis trying to notice when those patterns come up and finding ways that I can, implement a healthier pattern. And obviously for everyone that will look different. It depends on your upbringing, your background, what you've experienced in life. But I think self-love is then the key thing that keeps you going throughout it. And it sounds so weird when you, like, someone says, like, say something nice about yourself, because it's like no one's taught me to do that before. And I think especially in our South Asian community, it's something we're really bad at, is being nice to ourselves, because there is so much competition, there is so much pressure. It's always like, oh, your cousin's doing this, or this person's child's doing this, that you constantly put yourself below others and think you're not doing enough. So self-love has been kind of game changing. For me personally, I started to do affirmations. It took me a year of trying to convince myself that I should try it, and it feels so cringe to begin with. But just working out, okay, I don't feel like I'm ever good enough, so what are the things that I could tell myself that are going to start to make me subconsciously feel like I'm good enough? And I think self-love is so important. Like, you wouldn't feel confident or empowered if you didn't have an element of self-love.
Yeah, and talking about like affirmations, what are some examples that people could use?
I mean, simple things like I'm loved, I'm worthy, I'm valued. Like, you can find loads on the internet. Like, social media is great if you want to find affirmation. But I think the thing that I do, which I personally recommend to everyone, is if you hear yourself saying something like I'm not good enough, or I'm bad at this, or I'm not a good person, or I'm not a good friend, flip that on its head, make that his affirmation. I am good enough. I am a good friend. I am a good person. It'll be different for every person as to what that affirmation or those affirmations need to be. But catch yourself thinking a negative thing about yourself, just flip it around and keep saying it to yourself over and over again.
Because it can be a bit cheesy, right? But as well as it is cheesy, but it's gonna do you like wonders, right?
Yeah. And I just think it's something ideally we should be given from birth, right? It's just positive affirmation and positive self-talk. But obviously that's not necessarily the way everyone's upbringing is. That's not the way life works. There is so much negativity that we're exposed to. So I think if you can be kind to yourself in those moments, it's the most important thing you can do for yourself.
Yeah, and what are ways people can, like, other than affirmations, is there any other ways for people, to get more involved with self-love? Like, how long will it take for people? Obviously, you can't guarantee, just say that you love yourself, but how can people build onto that, and like how long should people be spending?
I think it's whatever you want to make of it. So it could just be simple things like journaling. Like, that's something I do every morning. It's a non-negotiable for me. And for me, it's just that I'm giving myself time to think about myself. Like, otherwise we usually wake up, first thing we probably do is go on our phones. We're always consumed in other things and other people that we don't necessarily find time for ourselves. So I definitely recommend having check-in points, whether that's through journaling, just so you can ask yourself how you feel, or making time to do things that you want to try or that you enjoy. And I think another thing I've noticed in our South Asian community is that we always put other people before ourselves. And that's something I'm really actively trying to work on at the moment, is that I need to put myself before others as much as possible. So simple things like the other day, like, there were dishes in the sink that I need to put in the dishwasher, but I needed to work out. So I normally would do that first and then work out. But I'm going to work out, do that for me because I know I need that, and then I'm going to do the work. So it's just simple things like that. It's just, how can you think about yourself and be kind to yourself as much as possible throughout the day?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I know, like, people might think you're selfish, but you know what, you're actually not, because it's so important to work on yourself, because then how can you apply that to other people?
I think we've just, like, butchered the word selfish at this point. I think we've genuinely, people who are just doing normal things for themselves, we perceive them as being selfish, and we need to take a step back and revise how we define selfish, because I think one of the most negative thought patterns I've been in is thinking that doing things for myself or taking care of myself is selfish. So I think if we can be a bit more intentional with how we think or use the word selfish, I think that could be beneficial.
Yeah, because nowadays there's so much you could do on your own. Like you could go for walks, you know, you could even like go for a lunch. You can even go cinema on your own, or you know, like. But you could start small and then do that, like you know, solo holidays and stuff. There's so much you can do, and it's like just finding what's best for you as well.
Yeah.
Like spending time with you is key, right? And it can be lonely at times, I think, as well.
It can be, but I think another thing I've noticed is a narrative that I picked up when I was a teenager was that I can't ever be by myself. That means I'm lonely and that means I have no friends or whatever. But actually realizing that time with yourself is healthy, and time with yourself allows you to check in with yourself, understand what's going on. And it could just be, you could be like doing your self-love by, I really wanted to try this one food, I'm going to go try it. Just doing things that make you happy or satisfy you is important.
Yeah, like even if you do it, let's say just even once a month, I guess is at least you're doing something.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the cadence of it can be set by yourself. So whatever works for you, everyone has different lives, different schedules. And at certain points in your life, you will need more self-love. And then in certain other points of your life, you might not have the capacity to give yourself so much self-love. So once again, if you want to build it into a routine, build it, but don't be too strict with yourself about it either.
Yeah, have a balance, right? And through your own journey, you know, you've been able to like build this up. You know, you've started your own kind of program, your business, championing youth minds. But through that, like you've been able to go to Downing Street. You know, you've had incredible opportunities. What were those opportunities like for you?
It's always felt very surreal, like being invited on stage and being told, can you just share your story? Like, I would always think the negative in me is always like, well, who wants to hear your story? Like, why? Who cares? But the thing in reality is people do care, and people do value stories and lived experiences, because it makes people feel like they're not alone and supports them through stuff. And I know for me, the most impactful thing has been the conversations that have followed those talks, those interactions, those events. Like, for example, I was in Gibraltar last year for World Mental Health Day, and I was doing talks in schools, and some of the messages I received from young people, and there was one particular young person who came up to me afterwards and said, I've been feeling suicidal, but I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't know who to talk to. And your talk has just made me feel like I'm not alone, and that I'm going to actually go speak to my teacher at the end of today. And then followed up, realize I did. But it's just small things like that, or just hearing from people that, you know, how you just being vulnerable has potentially saved their life, I think is huge. And I think for me, that's why it feels so surreal, is because once again, if you asked 13-year-old me, I would have never thought that there would be anything good that would have come from those experiences at all.
Yeah, because, you know, you've even gone to Down Street. What was it like meeting? Did you meet Rishi then there?
No, met his wife.
Oh, okay.
That once again was a surreal experience. Found out Priti Zinta was there and Akshay Kumar was there, and I was like, this is so random. Once again, 13-year-old me wouldn't have thought. Yeah, I mean, but I think one thing I've also realized is like I used to really idolize people. And I think that's something we all do, especially as younger people. We like idolize and glorify people. But so actually, they're just like normal human beings. Like, I don't think it's who you are, and I don't think it's what you do. I think it's how you impact other people, and what you do, you know, to support other people, I think is incredible. And I think one thing I always say to other people who, you know, have struggled with their mental health or have stories to tell in other areas is, don't focus so much on the glitz and the glamour, because I think there was always a part of your ego which is like, I want to be doing this, I want to be in the spotlight, I want to do that. But it's like I said, going back to those, it's those conversations afterwards, it's the people you've impacted, it's the people who you also learn from. The amount of people I've met, and I've learned such incredible amounts from them, being exposed to those life experiences. I would never have had that opportunity if I was just, you know, just doing my 9 to 5 and that was it.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned about idolizing people, and in that sense, you know, people obviously want to be like this person. I want to look like this person, but like at the end of the day, just be yourself, right? I know it's easier, obviously, said than done, with everything that we've talked about, but I think, you know, just being able to be yourself is what's key.
Yeah, and I think sometimes in the world of social media, the world that we live in now, we don't actually know who we are. Like, even now, I'm like trying to figure out who am I? What do I like? Am I just saying I like this because I've seen people do it on social media?
Yeah.
Do I want to do this, or is it because it's a trend? Like, all of those things. It's just about defining yourself. I think once you know yourself, the world around you becomes easier to understand. And I wish that we could live our lives that we find ourselves first, and then we are exposed to the outside world. But obviously, like you said, it's about self-discovery, and you discover yourself as life goes on.